Hello and welcome to the King's Library at Stockholm's Royal Palace and the 2006 Nobel Minds debate. I'm Sarah Montague, and with me are 6 Nobel laureates, the winners of this year's prizes for physics, chemistry, medicine and economics. These are people who've made huge contributions to our understanding of the way the world works. In a moment, I'll be talking to them about their discoveries, what motivated them, and putting some of your emailed questions to them. But first, let's take a look at each of the laureates and the reasons they've won a Nobel Prize. John Mather and George Smoot are the joint winners of the 2006 Nobel Prize for Physics. Their work on the very first forms of light has gone a long way to confirming the Big Bang theory of the origins of the universe. They did it by measuring something called cosmic microwave background radiation. And rather as George Smoot directs this big band on a football field, so their work is the first evidence of how matter came together to form galaxies, stars, and of course, ultimately, even life forms like ourselves. Roger Kornberg is the winner of this year's Chemistry Prize. He's been here before when he was 12. Then he was with his father, Arthur, as he collected his Nobel Prize for medicine. Like his father, Roger's work deals with the very smallest building blocks of life. He was the first to produce a precise atomic picture of RNA transcription, the process by which the genetic information in DNA is copied so that it can be used to shape particular proteins. Andrew Fire and Craig Mello are this year's Medicine Nobel laureates. Their work also deals with RNA. Through examining nematode worms like these, they discovered how genes can be shut off by injecting double-stranded RNA. In just 8 years, this mechanism, known as RNA interference, has become one of the most important tools for studying what genes do. And as such, it opens the way to possible treatments for cancers, heart disease, and many kinds of virus. Edmund Phelps is the winner of the 2006 Economics Prize. He was born in Chicago during the Great Depression. And as he grew up, he became increasingly curious about the reasons for unemployment. The long post-war boom produced the theory of a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. But Edmund Phelps challenged this orthodoxy. He showed that our expectations about how much inflation might rise also played an important part. Gentlemen, welcome. And I want to start with the moment when you realised that you had done something really rather special. John Mather, there was a very clear moment for you when the Kobe satellite was launched, wasn't there?
Yes, well, when it went up and it didn't explode, that was a wonderful moment. But the one where I really knew how important it was when we presented our first results to the Astronomical Society meeting, and we showed the spectrum of the background radiation, which is a description of the color of the universe and the color of the Big Bang. And people cheered. An entire room full of people, astronomers, just stood up and clapped and cheered. And we knew that was really, really, really important, and more than we had ever dreamed it could be.
But it was interesting because what you had done there was the first, I suppose, evidence, the first form of proof that the Big Bang theory was right.
Well, to me, it wasn't the first form. It was exactly what I expected. But there had been doubt in the recent years because we kept on doing measurements that did not agree with the theory quite right. And so something was clearly the matter. Either the experiments were wrong or the theory was wrong, and we certainly would be glad if it was the Big Bang that was right, because everyone expected it to be right. We've known about the Big Bang idea since 1927 when Georges Lemaitre proposed it, and since 1929 when Edwin Hubble observed it. But the idea that it might not still be correct in 1990 was a big challenge.
Right. Now, George Smoot, you also got the physics prize with John Mather. It was slightly different for you because the satellite goes up and immediately the evidence that you need or the measurements come in for you, John Mather. For you, George Smoot, it was slightly different. It took longer, didn't it?
It did. Like John, of course, I was there for the launch, and it was spectacular that it made it up and didn't blow up and it didn't go off course and all that kind of stuff. And it was also exciting that they discovered Antarctica, which was, the fact that when you fly over Antarctica, the sunlight reflects off it and the solar cells are on. And I had been begging for them to turn on my instrument as soon as possible so we could know if it worked, if it survived the rigors of launch. And they said, oh no, we'll follow procedures. And in fact, they didn't blow the lid on the door for over a week. But as they went over Antarctica, the power was too great on on the solar cells. So they said, "Would you turn on our instrument because we need to burn up the power?" And I said, "Well, just this once," and turned it on, and the source came on. We have an internal source so we can calibrate it, and then it started rotating around and scanned by the moon, and so we knew, within an hour of launch that the equipment were working. And then the problem was we had to accumulate hundreds of millions of observations and process them and study them. And then when we started making maps, they were better than anyone had made before. But we had to see how much was due to the instrument itself, how much was due to the foreground, the stars in our own galaxy and things like that. And so it took a long time to convince ourselves that what we really had was a signal that was coming from the universe. And so the aha moment didn't come until 2 years after launch, that we finally knew, yes, we had observation of the real universe.
Roger Kornberg, for you, there was decades, I know, of when you were working on something, but there was a very clear moment, wasn't there, a moment of discovery?
Look, what I would say was there was, in fact, a moment at the beginning and one at the end. At the beginning, an idea of how to exploit molecular diffusion to determine the structure of a molecule larger than had been studied before. And then at the end, success in finding the structure of the molecule, which I can show you.
Okay, now before you do, molecular diffusion, this is single...
So I had studied diffusion in 2 dimensions, diffusion of molecules in a plane, and one day thought of a way in which we could take advantage of that to form crystalline arrays of very large molecules, which would in turn make possible revealing their structure at the atomic level.
Right, and the moment that you did that, was it a very clear moment you thought, this is it, I've done it?
It was clear enough that I can remember the date and the time. So I can recall looking at the clock at 18 minutes after 6 on it's 5 minutes after 6 on the 18th of December in 1999, thinking this was a moment to remember.
Which is extraordinary. And now, what had you achieved at that moment?
So then we knew the structure would emerge from the data we had collected. We didn't yet have the structure, but we could see that we had all of the information required. There are 2 types of information that are needed to solve a structure in this way. Measured intensities of photons scattered from the molecule, and then in addition to that, knowledge of their relationship to one another, which is called a phase relationship. And it was at that point that we knew that the phases that we had calculated would give a meaningful structure.
Okay. Now, I know you've brought something to illustrate the significance of this, because you have a model, don't you?
So I can show you a space-filling version of the molecule. The actual molecule is made of 30,000 atoms, and in reality is only about a millionth of a centimeter across. So this is a much enlarged version. It is composed of a dozen individual proteins that are assembled to produce an object with the appearance that you see here.
Right. So it's basically, it's the machine, it's the mechanism by which transcription, the code goes from the genes and is transferred effectively to make proteins.
This is a device for reading genetic information, and it produces a copy of that information that is then delivered to other places in the cell or in the body where the information is then put to use.
Okay. Edmund Phelps, for you, I think as well, there was a point at which you thought, look, I've proved something. But it was some time ago.
It was a long time ago, but basically what I was trying to do was to, we kind of had a macroeconomics of unemployment and inflation, but we didn't have any microeconomics to support it. We had nothing underneath it. It was just floating there. There were no firms, nobody setting wages, nobody setting prices. So I set out to provide some microeconomic foundations. And of course, I didn't have a roadmap about how to do that.
Because the thinking at the time was that you couldn't have an unemployment get below a certain level without having an impact on inflation.
Right. That was one of the one of the key claims of the pre-existing macroeconomics. I knew there was probably a problem with that, but even if there hadn't been a problem with that, I was still interested in trying to do some microeconomics to go with to support whatever, to support some sort of macroeconomics. So one problem is, why is there ever any unemployment at all? That was a tough one. And but I'm not sure there was a day when I felt I cracked that. It was just kind of a gradual seepage of insight.
But what you came up with, in a sense, was you put the human factor back in, that humans have certain expectations.
So I imagined in my mind real live firms setting money wage rates every day or once a year or whatever, and setting prices, and try to put myself in their shoes and think, what would I do if I were a firm setting prices and wages? And so then I, as I always believed, I wanted to bring in what sorts of expectations these people would have to have in order to make a calculation. What would they be thinking? And then I realized, well, they would be asking themselves what other firms are going to do. What are they going to do with their wages and their prices? I would like to know that when I set my wages and my prices. So that brought in
and when
wage expectations and price expectations into the theory.
And so you effectively adopted what was the model at the time, the Phillips curve. Did you realize
then it was a question, will this sort of microeconomics deliver the macroeconomic Phillips curve, or if not, what will it deliver?
Did you realize how significant it was, the work you'd done?
Well, I knew I was dealing with hot stuff that would make me or break me in the economics profession.
And of course it made you.
Yes, although it was a very controversial area for a long time. There are a lot of brickbats.
Well, we'll come back to that. Let's move on to the Medicine Prize, because Craig Mello and Andrew Farr, for you it was obviously much more recent. It was 1989 that you had this breakthrough. And again, it was very clear, wasn't it, Craig Mello?
It was 1998.
Forgive me.
Even more recently. I wouldn't say it was so clear. I think we had a lot of doubt in our minds at the time of the discovery. I think Andy made a point of that in his lecture, and certainly it was true at the time. And I think that doubt was justified, because the complexity of the silencing pathways that go on in all of our cells is such that there are many ways it can be triggered. And we discovered or happened upon one way that can trigger this type of silencing that can turn genes off.
Okay, because what you were looking for, Andy Farr, is why and how genes were switched off.
We were looking for the how of what genes being switched off. We were maybe thinking about the why in the back of our heads, and the initial experiments suggested a very specific model involving double-stranded RNA, and that's what we were apprehensive about. Did we really get it right? Was that really the material that was shutting it off, or was it something that was in there by mistake that was at some very low concentration? And so really being sure of that being the material responsible took, from the earliest sort of suggestions at the beginning of the summer of '97 to being at least sure enough that we sent the paper off at the beginning of the fall of that year was an interesting time, exciting and a little scary.
Right. We've had a tremendous amount of emails, of course, asking lots of questions of all of you. Many people want to know about the motivation, what it is that inspires you. And Roger Kornberg, there's one from Francisco Javier Campos in Mexico, who is asking about what inspires you, and presumes that it must have something to do with your father, because of course your father, as we say, won a Nobel Prize. Is he right?
You're asking a question about my childhood in a way, and I often point out to people that 30 years of struggle, intense struggle to solve the problem that we did, was anything but child's play. And I think indeed that the adult motivation is what really prevails and matters in this case. And it takes primarily one form, which I think I would say is true in my case, but I imagine is more general, and I guess from all the scientists I know is very often the case. We like to solve problems. We just enjoy taking up a challenge and struggling to discover the answer. And it could be in any one of many fields, but especially the fun and the challenge and ultimately the reward of problem solving is a primary motivation.
Right, but there must be something that you're in a situation, I mean, and it's from when you were young, because when you were young, as I understand it, for a Christmas present, you asked for a week in the lab, is that right?
So I'm told.
You knew what you wanted to do.
Right. But I can tell you that I personally was interested in very many things, and only, like most people at the stage of the university or shortly thereafter, was forced to narrow my focus and actually settle on one thing that I would do for a long time thereafter.
Right. Edmund Phelps, for you, was it clear what you wanted to do? Because we said you were born in the Depression, but did it have an effect on you? Because you did get very interested in unemployment.
Yes, but I was only 4 or 5 years old when the Depression was coming to an end. So I don't think that we can say that those Depression years experience was formative for me.
Well, because, let me give you another email from Belarus. Somebody wondering perhaps if it was a teacher or a lecturer in economics that had a particular influence on your career.
Oh yeah, there was a whole string of them. I was so lucky. I like to say that I like to thank Mrs. Murphy. She was my second grade teacher.
It does go back.
No, but she taught me to read and write, and she was a tremendous. I never forgot her name my whole life. And then in college. I should remember, I studied a lot of music in high school. I did a lot of music, and the high school created a musicology course for some of us. So I studied some composition theory and whatnot in high school. I thought that was pretty unusual. But then, okay, economics. Well, in college, I had 2 wonderful teachers who certainly made a decisive difference in directing me toward economics. Otherwise, without them, I might have gone into philosophy or something else.
George Smoot, there is an assumption among a lot of people who email us that actually you're working towards a Nobel Prize. Is that in any sense true?
It never was a motivation for me. It was wanting to know the answer. I want to know, I want to know what the universe is, how it came into being, and where it's going to go, and I want to see that in my lifetime we've gone from knowing almost nothing to knowing how to describe the universe to better than 1%. And that's, to me, that would be an incredible intellectual achievement for mankind to be able to do that. And I want to personally be involved in it. And so it's ever since I was a little kid, I was starting to take stuff apart, and sometimes I could put it back together, but I just want to know how things work, but I really want to know how the universe works.
Right, and presumably in the lab it's the same thing. You've got to be fired by the day-to-day, Andy Fire.
Yeah, it's definitely the day-to-day things that keeps one going. It's nice to have one's long-term goals set towards something that's going to benefit mankind, but going from day to day, you have to enjoy each little experiment working or not working, and interacting with colleagues and talking with people, and just being able to decide. One luxury we have actually in biology, or in molecular biology, working with a very small organism that has a 3-day life cycle, is each day or each week you can go into the lab and decide to do a set of experiments. So that's sort of fun.
But I think some of the challenge for a lot of people is that they see they see something like the Nobel Prize and they hear what you've won it for, and they think this is amazing, and I can see the excitement in that. What they struggle with is seeing the beauty in day-to-day experiments. Is that a problem for you, Craig Mello, or is it just something that you see it every day?
Well, I'm just going to sort of change the question a little bit, because I think, listening to all of us around the table, it's clear that there's really a common language here to discovery. Fortunately everyone speaks English in science for me, but it's not English that I'm talking about. It's a language, I think, of discovery, and the first three words in almost every sentence in this language are, I don't know. Those three languages are then followed with the word but, because we always have an opinion, and we want to express that opinion. So then we'll go into our opinion of how things work. And quite often, the thing that's wonderful about this language is because you're admitting, first of all, that you don't know, and then you're expressing your opinion. You're opening a dialogue. You want to know what the other person has to say. And that's a wonderful thing because it brings people together. Even if you have different ideas, it'll bring you together.
John Mather, I mean, that sounds exactly, in a sense, what you were doing, wasn't it? Because you have an idea, this sort of a vast, seemingly unsolvable one, and there's 1,000 of you brought together to try to solve it.
Yes, it's very much the same process that has been described here. We always start off saying, well, I don't know how to do this. We know what the tremendous challenge is that's in front of us, but it's always, I don't know how to do this. And let's find a way today if we can get past this particular obstacle. And when a particular challenge requires a space mission, as ours did, then the idea attracts brilliant people to come work with us. And so it's not our idea alone, but this problem that we've worked on is so important, and so many people recognize that it's important, that it was possible to bring all this effort together in a coherent way.
But the obstacles that you mentioned can also be huge, and I know in your case, one of the things you were expecting for your satellite to go up on the space shuttle, and then, of course, the Challenger crashed. Now, that must have been a huge setback.
It was a huge setback indeed. We were already building and assembling the flight payload to go up on the space shuttle. So in 1986, we kept on working after the Challenger blew up, but we had to go hunt for a new rocket. And we were extraordinarily fortunate that our engineering team could find another rocket to use. The one that they found didn't exist. It had to be assembled from spare parts because the production line had been stopped for those rockets. And we also had to cut off half the mass of our payload in order to fit it onto the capability of this new rocket. And so this was a huge challenge, but as soon as it was solved, as soon as we saw that there was a path, then people worked night and day to finish the job. And we were the first science mission to be launched after the Challenger exploded. So we benefited in a very curious way from this terrible disaster that we got to go next.
It's something that we had, Ji Wei from Singapore emailed us about, and particularly asking, because for both of you, she said, how do you keep going when you have a setback like that, George Smoot?
All right. Oh, I was going to add something else, but I'll go to this first. And that is, I wanted to know, I still wanted to know, but I also had taken on a role, which was principal investigator, which means you lead the development of your instrument, just like John was leading development of his instruments. And so, as principal investigator, you have to lead. That is, you have to find a way to go forward. And that's what leadership is, when things look terribly bleak, but you have a really good thing that you need to accomplish, right? You've got to find a way to do it. And, so we explored went to talk to the French Space Agency to see if we could launch on a French rocket. And we talked to the Russians and so forth. And NASA, woke up and said, they were, the people in headquarters at NASA were shaken by this disaster very much. But when they saw that we really wanted to go forward, they responded. They said, oh, we have some, we'll get back in space. We're a space agency. We'll get back in space. And here are some people that want to do it. And that's, So it was a grassroots as well as a leadership issue. People wanted to do the mission, and you just had to tell them there's going to be a way, and they stayed on it. We're not depending upon a few great men who appeared out of the vacuum and did that. There's a whole structure of science that's really quite incredible. And so young people that want to go into science, they need to learn this culture of science, the background of how you come up with new ideas. The fact there's a body of knowledge that you have to study, but question it and see what needs to be probed, what's new.
But there will be people watching this thinking, look, it's easy for you. All of you are Americans. This structure that exists in America. It doesn't exist in other countries around the world.
It's beginning to exist in many other countries around the world because people have seen the success in the United States of how science has led to these great discoveries and therefore new industries. So one of the things that happens in the United States is new companies, there's lots of entrepreneurs starting new companies, and that comes from the fact that there are spin-offs. I've had former students and postdocs go and start companies right? I have three of my students have done quite well, starting their own companies and doing some
I think the
things like
internet
that.
revolution has brought all of us together. So I worked every day with somebody from Singapore, another colleague from Iceland, who were in instantaneous contact, trading 100-page papers back and forth.
This is
in-
what
in
I was talking
seconds.
about too. It's an international language. It's a human. Science and all academics really is a human enterprise. It's basically we all speak the same language, even though we don't all speak one language. We have this common. It's unifying and it's
But you
wonderful.
are all American, and there is Dominica, who's a 15-year-old in Slovakia, emailed to say, what advice would you give to a student from a God-forsaken place who has no money for university, who would like to do some research, be useful to society, maybe get a Nobel Prize one day? I mean, Andy Farr, do you have an answer for Dominica?
Well, except for the last thing, which is sort of a random fluctuation in the universe. But in terms of making progress, there are educational opportunities in every country. And then one of the things that countries, Sweden, Britain, US included, have are some opportunities for people to come from overseas, especially if they've really distinguished themselves in their home countries, and study there.
But that's ultimately it, isn't it? Do you have to go to America, Roger Kornberg? Do you have to go to America or Europe if you want to get advanced in science?
You certainly have to go to a center of science or be exposed to science being done in the way that George Smoot referred to earlier. I think that makes a huge difference. I mean, something did emerge from efforts over a very long period of time that creates a context. And I think I understood what George was explaining very well in that sense. Now, it might amuse you to know that at the time when, in 1972, when I finished graduate work and was ready to proceed to the next stage of doing postdoctoral study, Mecca for molecular biology was not in the United States, it was in Cambridge, England.
Still to some extent is.
To some extent, very much, I would argue to a much lesser extent. And you may disagree, but at the time, I might add, about 50% of our science was done in the United States and about 50% in major European laboratories. And today, about 80% is done in the United States. And this, of course, reflects a combination of factors, the level of funding in the United States and the openness of American science to the participation of students from abroad, students and fellows who come from abroad who are welcomed in the system and feel at home in it.
And you say that's not the case in Europe?
Having myself worked in 2 different European laboratories as a student, I can say that I felt welcome and I had a marvelous time, but it wasn't the same.
Maybe I should beg to give a different experience. 11 years later in the same department, I felt extremely welcomed and in fact, felt that I worked in a place in Britain that had a very different scientific structure, although it was not necessarily better or worse in either place, and actually learned a tremendous amount from that I hope that I've taken to the departments that I've come to in the United States to try and combine the two. And I think that's one of the advantages to people traveling around, is to come back to their home country or their home institution and try and provide the kinds of advantages that you get from traveling around and talking to people.
Joel Mather.
Well, I'd like to return to the question a little bit. So a young person trying to see what to do next, and reminding that, at least for myself, I grew up in the country where I lived in the rural area, and so my strategy to do what she was talking about was to read every book that I could get from the public library, and to ask for help from my teachers in schools to get something special for me here and there. And so asking for help and reading all the books there were was my strategy to get out of that area and on to the next thing. And so you can't really make a plan for life, but you can always look for the next thing that's nearby. And so, reading and teaching yourself as many things as you can is a wonderful strategy if you're in a place where you don't see the next step. So then you'll find it.
Talking about the dominance of America in science, the fact that you are all Americans, we've had an email from Brazil, Helena Tompa-Cautera, asking, what do you suppose will be the future of science in third world countries such as Brazil? George Smoot, do you have a view on that?
Well, I have a strong view on that because I've had 3 graduate students from Brazil, and they're back now in Brazil, and one's a professor in São Paulo, well, graduate students and postdocs. One's a professor at São Paulo, one works with INPE and San Jose dos Capos, and one of them is actually married to a Swede. They met in graduate school, and she's the one that I worked with to set the lower limit on the size of the universe. And now they have kids, and they live in MIT. And she will eventually go back to Brazil. But I also have had other postdocs and collaborators there. So it's building up. You know, the theory has built up very well in Brazil, and now the experimental part of the physics is building up.
I suppose another place that is increasingly becoming more of a science centre is China. And is that, I mean, can you envisage a situation, George Smoot?
Well, I don't want to hog it, but this is very interesting because this brings the economics and the science together in a very clear way. About 3 or 4 years ago, the leaders of China realized that if their goal to become a dominant world economic power, say number one, was going to be necessary for them to be number one in science. And they consciously set out a plan to do that. And that plan involves adopting Western science modes. And they take the very best graduate students, the top 10th of the 1% of their graduate students, and they send them to the best American universities they can because they want them to learn what I was referring to as the culture of science. And I've had a couple of those students come, and they're extraordinary students. I mean, the top 1% of China's students. They come in unbelievably prepared, but they come in from a system that's not an open system for learning and scientific inquiry and so forth. And they come and they're exposed in American universities, and then the hope for China is they'll go back and they will become the new leaders to transfer that culture to China. And they learn that they have to do that because they've seen the hierarchical system fail for them, and the bird flu was an example. Indeed. Which was very embarrassing.
But Edmund Phelps, it's interesting that China recognises that its system is not the best to cope for the scientists and sends them overseas. Do you think how far can its current system, effectively the economic system, go if it's to develop the talent within its own country?
Well, the system seems to be working extremely well at this stage in its development. So, and I think China's success is a shining example and a kind of a wake-up call for what's possible to the rest of the third world. I mean, I think India has taken notice that China has shown that rapid growth is possible. But of course, at some point, China will need to evolve a more sophisticated economic system in order to keep that growth going.
At some point,
I would guess that China will become more and more like the United States, and the economy will become more and more like the American one. Or, you know.
What does sophistication mean in an economic system?
Well, a sophisticated financial sector.
Capital markets.
Including in particular capital markets.
But you say it as a wake-up call to developing countries.
Yeah.
Could it not also be a wake-up call to America?
Well, I'm at a loss to know whether I should be worried on that front. I don't see that the United States is receiving unalloyed gains from China's growth, because we used to have some gains from trading with East Asia based on the fact that they were so different from us. They were at such a different level of development. If they become carbon copies of the United States, we won't have any longer any basis for gains from trade. It would just be like trading with ourselves. We would sort of run out of gains from trade. Now, okay, if China becomes a highly innovative place for new science and all, that's of course another dimension of the thing.
Do you think there's a cultural difference, though? Because it is, the sort of dominance of America, perhaps between East and West. Roger Kornberg, do you think there's anything a cultural difference that means that America owns science?
Look, I think an important question, in my mind, as a novice and relatively uninformed about these matters, is the source of innovation. It's not entirely clear to me that spending a lot of money to develop science, or even sending students abroad, is going to be sufficient to encourage the sort of innovation that they seek. I think the society also has to have a degree of openness, which it lacks.
Right.
and it's unclear whether that will be permitted. So they may spend a lot of money to create a structure for science, but it may not deliver as hoped.
Right.
Sarah, I think the Chinese are amazingly experimental and adventurous. So I think they're natural-born entrepreneurs. The question is just whether the government will be open enough to that entrepreneurship.
To that, as to emphasize that point, Chinese in Singapore, Chinese in Hong Kong were already well advanced in the 21st century, but before the rest of us past the millennium. On the other hand, Chinese within China were held back to a previous era.
Right. Sure, Mello.
Well, I was also thinking that, that part of the difference in the numbers of Nobel Prizes that go to different places relates to just how much government support has there been. For many years, the United States has been a very generous supporter of science. The people have liked it. One of the founding members of the country was a scientist, Benjamin Franklin, one of the great scientists of his day. And so it's somewhat traditional and a very practical application that the U.S. public has seen for science. So I think the idea is catching on around the world that this is a good thing. And so we would expect that, since ideas travel at the speed of light, that competition for the United States will also grow rapidly around the world. So I don't know, as Dr. Phelps says, whether this is an unalloyed gain for the United States for us to be developing our competition, but it happens. And I think we can't tell people where to go. If other governments decide to support science, good science will be done there. So it will happen.
George Smoot, now it's often assumed that if you're coming up with answers to how the universe came about, and we've had plenty of emails about this, it's assumed that if you're dealing with that you can't believe that God had anything to do with it. Does your science, is it your science that might prevent you from believing in God?
No, I don't see any conflict between science and religion at this level, except for the ones that people make. I mean, there's people on both sides that get into arguments for argument's sake more than for the reality. We have a prime example back from Galileo, where Galileo's point was science tells us how the heavens go, but religious tells us how to go to heaven. You know, the same sort of word. And in fact, it's only when one tries to step on the other one's domain that you end up with conflict. I mean, we're trying to describe the physical world and you know, and how it actually behaves and what our place is in it. You know, here's how the universe existed and how the stars and the galaxies and the planets and then life arose. Right? That's the work of the people around here, and this, you know, how people interact day to day. That's the physical world, and then the question of what you should have belief in, you know, and how you should behave ethically and so forth is in a different domain.
But if you're making discoveries about the way that the universe started, does it affect one's faith?
Well, if you believe that the Earth is flat, and you walk around, you know, you will. I mean, really? if your religious views hold it, or if you are in a religion that decides that because the universe is a certain way, then that means there had to be God, and then when we find the universe is different, that's going to affect your religion. I mean, it's you know, you have to be somewhat sensible about what you think your religion actually says, right? And that's one of the problems today, is that there are people who deviate from, you know, I would say a more spiritual view into a worldview.
Right. I mean, I'm asking the question of you because, of course, you're dealing with the very big picture. Craig Mello, you're dealing with the very small picture, and in a sense, it's the same thing. There are people who think that that science contradicts religion.
I don't think it does. I don't think it has to. I think if your religious beliefs interfere with your gaining understanding of how the world really works, as for the example with Galileo, then it could be a problem. But I think religion is really about ethics, and ethics are something that we all have to deal with. They're a very personal issue of what is right and what is wrong. Ultimately, you have to decide whether you believe that God is telling you what you need to do to be a good person, or whether you simply feel that to be a good person, I have to take responsibility, I have to live a certain way. We all have to deal with that. So science can't possibly touch this question of ethics. But I do think what's exciting to me is the way that science brings us together with this admission that we don't know. We always have to do that. And it always begins a dialogue. It's a way of learning about the world. And I think that people around the world are beginning to appreciate that science is bringing good things to humanity, and that this is a way of knowing about the world. They see the value of it, and I hope that more people want to participate in that culture of science.
Roger Kornberg, do you think that, or do you think that perhaps religion can interfere with science?
On the one hand, I would have to agree with what the others have said. Insofar as religion relates to ethics, then it's a separate issue. Science doesn't teach us about morality. On the other hand, it is true, and very unfortunately the case, often religion does overstep those bounds and attempts to teach us about the way the real world is and the physical reality in regard to the teaching of evolution, for example, in biology, and I imagine the way the universe got created, if you take literally the time frame of the Bible and so forth. And in those matters, there's a fundamental clash between scientific thinking and faith. And I, for one, am very impatient with a faith-based approach, and others of my colleagues likewise.
Right, but you work alongside religious people?
I know some of the finest scientists that I have known, so amongst them students in my own laboratory, are able, within their own minds, to reconcile science and religion, and it's fine, in my view, if they can manage so successfully. I believe I myself would be unable.
Well, exactly. You sound extremely doubting. One wonders if you would distrust a scientist who believed in God.
Knowing the people that I have just said, I don't at all.
But you haven't been able to effectively explain it to
I can tell you,
yourself.
before I met them, I would have thought it impossible.
Do you have, John Mather, is this something that you...
Well, I think about it a little bit from time to time, of course, because everybody asks me this kinds of question. But it seems to me that scientists are busy finding out how does the physical universe work, and that none of us humans have any business deciding what God could or could not have done. So we should not be telling God how the universe was made. We should be looking to see how the universe works. And so if our religion contradicts what we see, we should rethink. And maybe our religious view was too limited.
But we talk about the ethics, Craig Mello, and there are it's the decisions that government imposes on science are determined by religions, aren't they?
In some cases they are, but I don't think that that's really. I think ethics really come from individual people making decisions. I think.
But for example, in America, you have the situation of the stem cell debate. There was restrictions on research, which in part come from a religious base.
I'm not sure that that's true. I think that's maybe how it may be polarizing people more than it should be. I think if you really had a dialogue about the core issues of, what is a life, when does life begin, what is a human life, maybe those are issues that people really just need to discuss more. I think that people are automatically, staking out positions without even really discussing the science or the issues that underlie these.
And Ify, are you comfortable with the way that the state decides the framework within which scientists can work?
The state has to decide a framework within which science works. That we work for the state and do things that are supported by the state because we benefit mankind, and so that's a common goal. And I think that comes from the ethical sort of combined ethical situation of the whole country or the whole world in some cases where science is supported worldwide. And so one has to work within that network. And I think a lot of science can be done very, very, very beneficially within those constraints. We have constraints in what we can do in many, many different ways, and people seem very comfortable with them.
Right, and presumably also pressures, John Mather, pressures towards a certain direction.
Well, it seems to me that there's an interesting dialogue between the public that supports science or opposes science and the scientists that want to do science, and the negotiation of the deal that enables this all to happen is quite a remarkable process. But I feel that the public has been very generous in support of science for many years, and our success is the result of that. So we're here because the public supports what we do.
Indeed, but are there sort of national security priorities that must affect what you do? I mean, you're sitting within NASA.
Well, at NASA we're civilians and we do things that are not secret for the most part. We have a few regulations about exchanging information with possible military implications, but aside from that, astronomy is very wide open and public. So everything that we did with the COBE project is perfectly open. The details of how you engineer something that might relate to international defense issues, well, we do have to be a little cautious about that, and the Congress has passed regulations for us to follow. So we do that.
Among the emails, there's one asking about, and it's something in a sense you talk about the dialogue between the people, scientists, and of course the politicians as well. Ignacio Correaz from Argentina wants to know which yet unexplored or not fully investigated scientific field or area do you think will be crucial for humanity in the 21st century? I mean, it's a huge question, but if you could influence the debate...
I'm sure it's going to start with, I don't know, but...
I'm sure you're right. But what would you follow the but with?
I really don't. I mean, I think that's one of the advantages of the diversity in science and people investigating different things. We all sort of bet on a horse in the sense of investigating fields that we think are interesting, but also we think might lead to some of those breakthroughs.
And what's your horse?
I mean, I personally think that we'll actually be able to tie clinical medicine in with science much more detailed level. And I'm excited by that prospect, but I think it's going to be actually quite difficult.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think information technology is such a key driving force for discovery around the world. I mean, where would we be without the computers that can process all the data? We have the genome sequence for the human. We have, in the future, I think we have to look forward to a time when we'll actually be able to know the genetic sequence of ourselves as a part of a routine checkup. And perhaps that's going to be scary in some ways. Your insurance might go up if you have some bad genes, but the good news is you might have treatments that are going to come along, and it'll be to your benefit to know what your genetic sequence is. These are exciting, very exciting days for medical research.
But what needs to be added is, and this is what someone asking a question like that ought to be informed, one of the best things about the science that all of us do is that you can't answer that question, that it's always something unexpected that emerges. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the joys of it. One of the beauties of discovery is you recognize it in part because of its novelty and unexpected nature.
If we knew what the next field was, we would already be working on it.
But you look at, Edmund Phelps, you look at what makes a good economy. Is there an answer that you would like?
Well, I think at a very general or abstract level, I think the good economy should be one that is rewarding in various ways to the participants, not just, and of course that would include real wages and purchasing power and all that, but also, as economies become more and more advanced, what goes on in the workplace is really more important than what goes on in the shopping mall. I think people's satisfactions are very much tied to the character of the jobs they have, the work they do. And so a good economy is one that has, therefore, a lot of employee engagement and job satisfaction, and that means intellectual stimulation, mental stimulation, new challenges, problem solving, discovery of your talents, the discovery of talents you didn't know you had, and all the personal growth that comes out of that. So that, for me, that's the good economy. Now there's a little bit more to be said about it, but I think that's the essence of it.
Is there a country that gets top billing? Because I know you've focused obviously on European countries most recently.
Well, funnily enough, there are data on this. You can there's a University of Michigan series that's gone around to many countries and asked a large number of people in each country, how much job satisfaction are you getting? how involved do you feel? How involving is your job? How much pride do you take in your work? And so you can, and countries differ quite a lot in that respect.
But it's just basically
even in the
a measurement of happiness.
Even in the G7 countries, U.S., Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, even among them, there are quite large differences.
And who gets top billing?
The U.S. and Canada are right up there.
Because the population is happy.
Well, they seem to. Well, oh, you mean are they always happy? Well,
but I was interested in what you were saying, because what you're talking about was satisfaction. You're talking about sort of. It sounds like you're talking about happiness rather than profits or.
No, but
I don't feel very comfortable with that word happiness, although I use it myself.
no, but it's satisfaction with your life.
Yeah.
It's a utility.
Pursuit of happiness.
For people to really feel like that they're important and they're doing something that's worthwhile, that gives them a sense of self-worth. In economic term, that is really very rewarding to people. And if you really want to have happiness that's internal and makes you feel in a good state, you need to feel that you're relevant to the world. And
there must be people watching thinking that given what you have all done, you must feel immensely rewarded. Roger Kornberg, I mean, some of the stuff that you've done in terms of what's followed on from it and the potentials, I mean, some of the treatments, it could be treatments for cancer, are those things that drive you?
Well, again, I would say that what really motivates us are the next questions that we can ask, and in particular the possibility of gaining an understanding at a deeper level from what we found to this point. So I referred to an arrangement of atoms that emerged from our work. That in itself doesn't answer the questions that we started with, but we can interrogate that and actually gain insight. That's the prime motivation. It is true that, and I've often argued that there is almost nothing fundamental that anyone can discover that won't have one day a beneficial application. Certainly in the biomedical sphere, that's true. There's almost nothing that we can learn that we can't one day put to use. The molecule that I study is an example because it's already a basis for developing better antibiotics, and one day will have implications.
But in terms of what gives you a kick, obviously, you've won a Nobel Prize, you've made some major discoveries. If somebody else went on and found a cure from cancer building on your work, which is the most satisfying thing?
No one has done that yet, so I can't really answer the question. But what I would tell you is that for me, again, the greatest satisfaction comes from the occasional insight, from understanding.
It's interesting that you're nodding, because these are huge questions and answers, but it's literally the day-to-day work.
It's the difference between internal validation and external validation. And that's what I was saying before. Your true sense of self-worth comes from having done something yourself that you know is right. It's really nice to have the external validation, but if you really like to feel that you did it, that you feel comfortable with yourself.
But that's a wonderful point as well, because we're talking mainly about science around the table, but the fact is that there are many ways that human beings find that sense of accomplishment and self-worth in art, music, just being creative, solving problems, helping other people. Many people derive, I think, a great deal of meaning by caring for people.
Indeed. But Edmund Phelps, you won, and we'd say that the work that you did for which you're being nominated was 40 years ago, and you were aware of its significance. You said, "This is hot," I think was your word. Were you slightly frustrated that it wasn't internationally recognized in the same way then?
Oh, it was recognized internationally.
But it's 40 years.
It was in the textbooks within 4 or 5 years.
Indeed, but it's 40 years later that you get the Nobel Prize for it, and there are people I know who came along later and have since been honoured.
Yeah.
Did you feel a slight, hang about, what about me?
I thought maybe that somebody had inadvertently skipped a step in the recognition process. But I'm immensely grateful that the processes are such that those little mistakes are corrected eventually.
So is there a sense in which you kind of think, I can relax a bit now, I've done it?
In my opinion, after having done something in the way that we and of us around this table have for such a long period of time, it becomes a way of life, and I don't think it's so easy to change.
Because not least because you've had a very recent discovery as well.
Well, it isn't only that, but it was an unrelenting effort over a very long period of time, and I don't think at my advanced stage I'd be able to adopt a different style. So I look forward to going back and doing exactly the same thing that I did before and avoiding as many of the distractions as I can, so as to continue to derive that same satisfaction that I alluded to previously.
Well, I think that there's something very interesting that we all should be engaged in, and that's talking about the future of our species, of humanity. And I think that's something that we don't do enough of. We don't plan ahead enough as a society. And I'd love to have, I see we need the insights from economists, we need our political leaders, but we need to all get together and think ahead more than 4 years, 10, 20, 50 years. If sea levels rise 50 feet in 50 years, that's going to impact our economy. What can we do about that? And these are discussions that we should be having.
Just briefly, John Mather.
Well, I was thinking in the same direction that humans are the first species that we know of that has the ability and possibility of planning ahead for more than a day. And we actually recognize now that our job leads to infinity. We get to manage our planet as best we can. And so we have some wisdom to apply and some lacks of wisdom to apply. And scientists are very deeply involved in the process. Okay. The things that we discover cause chaos in the planning, but we also help people respond to that chaos by discovering new ways to deal with it. So a planetary plague, well, we'll be involved in helping to defend ourselves. The global warming, will be involved in helping to defend ourselves. So we're clearly part of the worldwide planning process.
Gentlemen, the conversation will continue, no doubt. We will have to leave it there. Thank you all very much for that discussion, and thank you all very much for joining us. Goodbye.
Savers restrained from
we